Today in the EU, why Brussels isn't at the Israel-Hamas peace talks, but should be. The fragile ceasefire negotiations between Israel and Hamas have stalled. There's a disagreement over how far Israeli troops should withdraw, according to the Associated Press. The EU has no way of intervening, it seems. It doesn't have a seat at the peace talks table. Yet, in the past 25 years, the Union has provided more than $500 million in humanitarian aid to Palestinians. It just pledged to give 120 more. So why isn't Brussels more involved in the halting of hostilities? Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Giada Santana, and this is Today in the EU. Rumors of a ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel first broke out on Wednesday. Things seem to have changed since. Members of the Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet have spoken against the agreement on X, including the National Security Minister. While political dialogues unfolds, the humanitarian crisis continues. To understand the situation on the ground, I'm talking to Yara Mowafy, Gaza Program Manager at Relief International.
Hi, Giada. Thanks so much for having me.
So your team is working on the ground in Gaza. What has been the mood like since the first news came out about the possibility of a ceasefire?
Yeah, first of all, Relief International is supporting hospitals in Gaza, in the middle area and in North Gaza. And so they're two very different areas experiencing this conflict differently. Of course, at first glance, it's a huge sigh of relief for all affected. People are excited. They're looking forward to what this means in terms of what their day-to-day will look like in the coming days and weeks. We've heard from our staff that they're excited to have a quiet night's sleep. But honestly, it's quite the cautious sigh. Despite the announcement, the shelling continues. And, we've had partner local organizations lose staff just hours after the agreement was finalized last night. Yeah, so like I said, healthcare facilities are continuing to be targeted. The shelling is continuous. So we're just hoping that it doesn't increase in the next days leading up to the actual start of the ceasefire.
So the deal will mark a temporary end to the fighting, but not to the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip, of course. So what has your work been like in the last weeks? What equipment and resources do you need the most?
Oh man, the last few weeks, in fact, months have been incredibly difficult, as you can imagine. The needs on the ground are just massive. They're so vast. Everything from critical healthcare services, availability of food, water, cash flow doesn't exist. There's massive needs in hygiene and sanitation that impact overall health for the population. We do coordinate very closely with the Israeli authorities to deliver aid through the border crossings. Most of our attempts as a sector to deliver aid, supplies, and medicine have been denied repeatedly. Again, not just the last few weeks, but few months. And so, that on top of the movement within the Strip itself being completely restricted makes it impossible to deliver goods and medicine to those health facilities and partners that we support.
And so how do you expect the ceasefire to make a difference in your work?
That's a great question. The humanitarian needs in Gaza have existed long before what happened October 2023. And so in terms of needs, we expect the needs to continue to be there. We're hoping that with the ceasefire, we'll be able to access the Strip more and more, bringing in more supplies and more aid. Based off of the agreement terms now, we understand that about 600 trucks will be allowed in daily. But of course, that's not enough, right, for the population that we're talking about. It's still not clear which crossing points are going to be open. So let me give you an example. The north of Gaza has been completely besieged for about 4 months. We have not been able to deliver any aid, any supplies into North Gaza.
Yeah.
In North Gaza, Relief International is supporting the last remaining hospital, Jabalia Hospital. Now, the north of Gaza is a place that is populated with 400,000 people. Of course, many of them have evacuated a little bit south, but most of that population remains with just the one hospital. So the biggest question around the ceasefire right now is will access to North Gaza change? And if so, how? And will NGOs, the humanitarian aid sector, and our community have access to North Gaza to bring in aid, supplies, medicine, water, all the things that they've run out of now for several months? And so that remains a big question mark. So we're really hoping to see that change, right? This is one of those things that we're hoping the ceasefire will have implications on, so we can access North Gaza and get those hospitals up and running again.
Thank you, Yara.
Of course. Thanks so much, Giada, for having me.
The extent of the damage NGOs witness is astounding, and the EU has pledged $120 million to devolve in humanitarian aid, but the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip will be way more costly than that, around 40 billion euros. Even talking about reconstruction, though, sounds premature when the deal is fragile and still has not been agreed. I'm asking Middle East expert and senior policy fellow Hugh Lovatt about the ceasefire, the aftermath of the conflict, and the part the EU will play in it.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So as we're recording, the ceasefire agreement between Hamas and Israel has not been signed off yet. Netanyahu's cabinet reported a last-minute crisis over details. Hamas on the other side denied that that's the case. In Israel, family members of fallen soldiers and hostages have taken to the streets to demonstrate against the ceasefire agreement. So what are the terms of this controversial document?
Well, the terms of the ceasefire, as they are laid out in the text of the agreement that have been approved by the parties, according at least to both the outgoing and incoming US presidents, and according to the mediators themselves, there is already a clear pathway for what will happen over the coming weeks. So The ceasefire itself is divided into 3 phases. Each phase will span 42 days. So in total, I believe that's something like 16 weeks. And the reason they do that is because obviously there's not too much confidence between Hamas and Israel. So it's a process of incremental gains for the parties. So what that means in practice is there will be an incremental release of Israeli hostages held by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. There will also be, in response to that, an incremental release of Palestinian prisoners held by Israel and the incremental withdrawal of Israeli forces, initially redeploying in Gaza, withdrawing from key roads, key arteries, and from populated Palestinian areas, but then ultimately fully withdrawing from Gaza in the second phase. And now where that finishes at the end of the third phase should be the beginning of the reconstruction of Gaza, which will take years, and also ending Israeli restrictions that have been on Gaza for at least 2 decades since Hamas took over in 2007. So there's a lot in there and a lot of details, and that is one reason why it has taken so long to negotiate.
Right. As you point out, this is not the first attempt at a ceasefire. The release of prisoners in exchange for hostages has been a point of tension in previous negotiation. And I was wondering, the deal was already on the table 8 months ago in May 2024, but it was still not signed. So what has changed now?
So there have been multiple ceasefire texts on the negotiating table, actually since the end of April, when the first text was proposed, I believe, by Egyptian mediators. And what happens is there's a text on the table. The Israeli side will say, actually, we have a few issues. They'll come back with their version of it. To be a little bit more precise, there was a Hamas proposal on the 6th of May, which is very similar to what was agreed now. Israel came back with its text on the 27th of May. That was the basis for President Biden's speech, which was a primetime speech in which the US president laid out his vision for a ceasefire.
Right.
And then finally, there was another text. There was a final agreement on the 2nd of July. And in that case, according to the mediators themselves that I've spoken to, Israeli negotiators signed off on it and Hamas negotiators signed off on it. So there was a deal on the 2nd of July. What happened was 2 days later, when Netanyahu had to give his final approval, he actually introduced new demands that were not previously part of the negotiations, and then therefore that blocked an agreement. And so I would say that that was a deliberate attempt on the part of Prime Minister Netanyahu to block an agreement at that point to avoid a coalition crisis. And it's not just me saying that, it's Israeli negotiators themselves, some of the mediators, Even Joe Biden at one point let it slip, but that was his view. So I think we need to be very attuned that there are a lot of political considerations on both sides, especially with Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has to juggle his far-right coalition members.
Indeed, AP reported that Netanyahu is under heavy domestic pressure within his far-right coalition, which has threatened to bring down the government in case of too many concessions done to Hamas. The deal is very fragile, and I want to talk about the role the EU has played, or well, lack thereof, in these negotiations. Hours before the news came out on Wednesday regarding the ceasefire, MEPs passed a resolution in favor of a deal, granted that all hostages are released and Hamas is dismantled. Now, this is the latest in a series of numerous texts passed by the European Parliament on the matter. Does it have any weight?
Well, when it comes to the ceasefire negotiations themselves, the EU itself has played no real role. And so this was very much a mediation or negotiating process led, I think, very professionally by the Qataris, Egyptians, and US officials, predominantly from the CIA.
One of our reporters confronted the Commission yesterday morning on that very point.
Hello, Thomas Mann-Nilsson at Euractiv. This is just to be clear. So was the EU involved in the negotiations to reach this ceasefire agreement, and then could it therefore take credit for this ceasefire having been reached?
I think I have been clear on this. The European Union warmly welcomes the ceasefire agreement, and we extend our gratitude to the US, Egypt, and Qatar for their efforts in negotiating the ceasefire.
And to go back to the question of the European Parliament, I think that, any resolution supporting this is great. But the question is, now what? How do you actually put in place? How do you use the EU's policy and funding instruments to be able to make this agreement, which is very fragile, actually more sustainable? And that will require funding and technical assistance in Gaza, but it will also require an investment of political capital to create a viable political Israeli-Palestinian process to end the broader Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I mean, you're right. And we had gotten used to the former EU High Representative, Josep Borrell. He was very vocal about the conflict. What do you make of the positioning of his successor, Kaja Kallas?
To be fair, she has not said that much. I think it's no secret that she comes in with a different set of priorities. Clearly, the eastern neighborhood, Russia, Ukraine, are important as they were, of course, for Borrell. But I think clearly this new commission, this new high representative wants to further emphasize that. So we have not heard much from Kallas yet on her vision for the future of Gaza, for the future of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what I would very much underscore is that anyone who is quite naturally and I think importantly attached to the future of Ukraine, to defending Ukraine, I think in that context, also defending the international rules-based order is very important, whether that's Ukraine or Israel-Palestine.
Yes, indeed. The EU had no part in upholding international law. Beyond expressing words of condemnation, it did not take part in the making of this deal, the mediators being Qatar, Egypt, and the US. But you've written extensively yet about how the EU could be a monitoring force to ensure that the deal is enforced in the end, especially in the phase 2 and 3 of the ceasefire agreement. My question is then, wouldn't it have made sense to be involved at the negotiation table as well?
My view has very much been that even while ceasefire negotiations were taking place, there was an important role for Europe to play in terms of beginning to shape what happens in Gaza after a ceasefire agreement is reached. So to explain that, the ceasefire agreement, as we talked about in the beginning, is very specific when it comes to how, when, and how many Israeli hostages will be released, Palestinian prisoners, etc. What it does not do is address the future of Gaza's governance and security arrangements.
Right.
Now, there's lots of ideas. We've heard Secretary Blinken lay out some American ideas, which I actually think are correct. It's perhaps a shame that Secretary Blinken waited till last week to outline them, but I think those are important points. The question is, how do you actually now expand upon them and operationalize them? I would have hoped that Europe could have worked over the past year to be able to forge more of a consensus and a plan for what comes after the ceasefire in Gaza in terms of post-conflict security and governance arrangements. What is the future of Gaza? What does that look like? Given that Hamas itself is not dismantled and will not be eradicated through military force, so there will need to be a political track. And I think Europe has an important role because of its technical expertise, because of its funding, but also because of its relations with the Palestinian Authority and Arab Gulf partners.
At the same time, the Palestinian Authority really has diminishing popularity in the Gaza Strip at the moment. So how do you see the EU reinforcing its consensus?
Yeah. So the Palestinian Authority is facing a dramatic, perhaps existential crisis of legitimacy amongst Palestinians. That crisis of legitimacy stems in large part from the absence of a viable political horizon for securing Palestinian self-determination. It is in part also due to Israeli actions, such as Israeli sanctions against the Palestinian Authority, which are pushing the Palestinian Authority into bankruptcy. But they are also due to the actions of the PA's own leadership, the refusal to hold elections, increasing authoritarianism, increasing human rights abuses. So there's blame all around. Now, as the main funder of the Palestinian Authority, Europe does have skin in the game. It is involved in this one way or the other. It is funding the PA. Therefore, it has the right to voice its opinion and probably perhaps also an obligation to assure itself that its money is used in the correct way possible. The question is, what does the EU prioritize? It has not prioritized the holding of elections, redemocratization. Exactly. And so this leaves the Palestinian Authority in a very weakened position.
Right.
And that weakened position domestically will make it more difficult for the PA to come back to Gaza, to also reach out to Hamas, because there will need to be a deal, whether we like it or not. It doesn't mean accepting Hamas's future control of Gaza, but it does mean understanding that Hamas has a veto over what happens.
And I would agree with you. I think this seems to be a sort of a fil rouge of every reporting story that we've done here at Euractiv on the Middle East, whether on Syria, on Lebanon. It seems clear what's at stake for the EU, and yet we see a lack of action. And this has been the way things are. So is it sensible to expect that the institutions will step up their stake in the game once the ceasefire is enforced, whether it is enforced, or should we just expect for the Union to continue on this path of inaction?
Well, the first thing to keep in mind is the EU has plenty of tools to use, so it absolutely can exert influence. The question is whether it can do that and whether it chooses to do that. Whether it can do that will depend, as always, on the extent to which there is member state consensus, which is always very difficult, but there are still things that the institutions themselves can do on their own volition. Now, is this in the EU's interest? What is the EU's interest to get involved? And I think it's clear, and it's been consistently clear over decades, that a festering conflict on its southern Mediterranean border will continue to be a source of instability and insecurity, not just for Israeli Palestinians themselves and the Middle East, but will continue to have blowback against Europe. So there clearly is a European, I think, interest in positively inserting itself in this conflict, in playing a positive role to be able to forge a more credible political track that can ultimately resolve this, and in a way that I think also supports European interests.
The question is if it will actually do it, right?
Indeed. And that is the perennial question, unfortunately, about these things. But again, there's been a lot of high-level political focus on this conflict, high-level political focus that has not always existed. And so there is clearly the fact that you have senior European officials, senior European leaders spending a lot of time on this issue shows that there is a political necessity to at least be seen to act, if not to actually also resolve it.
Thank you, Hugh.
Thank you.
This was Euractiv's podcast, Today in the EU. Sound design by Miriam Sáenz de Tejada, research and production by Charles Cohen. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news and sign up for our newsletters. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and your favorite streaming platforms. Don't forget to subscribe and give us a review. It will really help us spread the word about our work. See you tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.